Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, May 4th, 2020, and today we're going to be discussing about the 2020 Senate elections and how the Democratic Party can win pretty much every winnable seat. Not necessarily how they can win, but what states are actually in play for them in the 2020 Senate elections. When we look at this 2020 map, the Republican Party has a pretty strong advantage looking after the 2018 midterms. In a Democratic wave year, the Republican Party was able to gain 2 seats, an overall net gain of 2 seats, compared to the 2016 Senate elections, 2017 if you include the Democratic win in the state of Alabama for Doug Jones, who was actually up for re-election this time around. But when you take a look at the overall landscape, the Republican Party is definitely defending a number of seats, but again, a number of them are considered safe. The Democrats currently need 4 pickups if they want an absolute majority, or if Joe Biden wins, 3 pickups. These are net pickups, which means that they can't afford to lose any of their other seats. But realistically, that's probably not what's going to happen. The Democratic Party will probably only lose Alabama, realistically, and probably gain a number of other seats. Now, the point of this Senate race is to see if the Democratic Party could have a very large majority. Looking at the competitive states, what states realistically could end up going for the Democrats and what that majority would look like. Again, this is sort of like, I guess you could say, a best case scenario for the Democrats. I'm going to keep the margins within a realistic boundary for a number of these states. This is essentially if every state went to plan for the Democratic Party. This does not mean that the Democrats will be gaining all of the likely Republican seats, but a lot of those lean Republican seats definitely are a lot more in play looking at this type of map. As for the Democrats, obviously, they will probably gain a number of seats in the 2020 Senate elections. This is just because in a presidential election year, the Democrats usually are the favorites in the Senate and House elections. Even if that doesn't mean winning the majority or losing the majority, they are expected to pick up seats in both houses of Congress. Now, both chambers of Congress. But looking at the 2020 Senate map, the Republican Party needs to defend a number of states that are traditionally Republican. This means that the landscape probably isn't too foreign to them. The Democratic Party is going to have to be working in states that they typically or rarely ever win in. For example, Kansas. The reason why Kansas is in play is because the 2018 governor nominee from the governor election, I just repeated that, the 2018 Republican nominee for the governor election lost his governor's race by around 5% in 2018 to a Democrat. Now, Kansas went to the Democratic Party on the governor level, not so much on the House level, though the Democrats did gain 16% more voters than they had in the 2016 House elections. Now, for the Senate election, that same failed Republican nominee for governor is now running for Senate. He's the clear frontrunner as of right now, and the current GOP chairman in Kansas is trying to take that away from him, mainly because they know that he'd probably be the only Republican to lose in Kansas. Kansas is a solid Republican state on the presidential level and is not really in play in any other election year except for this one. So this Senate election is really important to a lot of Republicans because the Republicans can win Alabama, but if it's canceled out by a win in Kansas and the Democrats are picking up seats in Arizona and Colorado, in Maine, then it looks a lot worse for them on the Senate majority level. Now, let's talk about some of these likely Democratic states. These are states that are probably going to go to the Democratic Party regardless of the rest of this map. That includes states such as Virginia and New Mexico, and realistically now the state of New Hampshire, which I currently characterize as a likely Democratic state, so I'll keep that there, but it is going to go for the Democrats pretty solidly. Realistically, they do have a number of areas that they can make pickups in. For example, Colorado and Arizona, which both of them I do expect to go to the Democrats as we hit the 2020 elections. It's about 6 months away, 183 days away, I believe, and it's going to be very interesting looking at these Senate pickups because Colorado already has a very unpopular incumbent running against a former and popular governor who actually ran for the presidency, John Hickenlooper, and then Mark Kelly in Arizona going against a Republican senator who was already rejected by voters 2 years prior to this election. So it doesn't look good for any of the Republicans in the Sun Belt except for the state of Texas. Now, Texas is interesting. Realistically, it's not going to be competitive on the Senate level. This is a state that is pretty solid for the GOP, and the Democratic Party doesn't have the same type of candidate that they had in 2018. That candidate ran for president and decided not to run for Senate again, and even if he did, the state would still probably end up going towards the Republican Party. Now, if we are talking about where the Democrats can win, there are other likely states that they can win in. That's because it's between 5 to 15% for my characterization. So Texas is probably, though in the lower end of that 5 to 15%, probably a 6 to 10 point margin for the Republican here. Still going to end up going to them just because Democrats are going to consistently hit a max in states such as Texas. This happened in the 2018 Senate elections, in which Beto O'Rourke visited every single county, didn't end up making a difference in the end because Ted Cruz was reelected. The margin was a lot closer, but again, Beto O'Rourke probably hit that cap for a number of Democrats. If Democrats are to win in a number of these states, it will have to be by a plurality, not by a majority. For example, Kansas, the Democrat won with 48% of the vote compared to 43%, with Greg Orban taking a pretty significant portion of both Democratic and Republican voters. If he wasn't in the race, the Democrats probably still would have won it, but it wasn't exactly the best scenario for the GOP because they ended up losing it anyway. For the Democrats, they definitely are going to hold on to Michigan and Minnesota in this scenario. They are going to be pretty close for states that previously were Democratic. Obviously, a lot closer in 2016, especially with Michigan going to the GOP, but 100% going to the Democrats, especially in this scenario in which the Democrats need to look at states that are realistic for them. As for Maine, this is a state that is very realistic for the Democrats. They have a formerly popular Republican senator, Susan Collins, who has fallen out of the grace of her constituency, and that honestly is one of the biggest blows to her campaign. She has never really had a competitive Senate campaign except for now. Sarah Gideon looks like she's on the pathway to actually win that Senate seat, regardless if this was the scenario or not. Now, for the Democrats looking at the South, it seems like they have a possibility of winning in any of those Senate seats. South Carolina has interesting polling data that shows it close. Mississippi was close in the Senate election in 2018, and Georgia has 2 Senate seats up, and they have a Democratic incumbent in Alabama and an unpopular Republican in North Carolina. And they also have a very unpopular senator from the state of Kentucky. Now, realistically, some of these states are just not going to flip. Even if the Democrats were to realistically focus all of their time and efforts on Mississippi and South Carolina, they aren't going to flip. The same can't be said for the state of Alabama, though. Though Doug Jones is a Democrat from the state of Alabama, do not expect that state to move away from him 100%. This is not going to be a safe red characterization on the final Senate map. Doug Jones drastically will outperform whichever, obviously at this point, the presumptive nominee, Joe Biden, in the presidential election by likely 10 to 15%. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to win, because if you compare that to the 2016 numbers, the Republican would still win by double digits, but realistically, the Democrats could win back or could hold on to the state of Alabama. This is not a state that's completely out of reach, but realistically, they shouldn't be focusing all of their time there because, again, it's probably within a 5 to 10% chance that Doug Jones does win here when they have a lot better, the Democrats, have a lot better chances in a number of other states. But Alabama is still in play. Now for Georgia, I do think that the overall at-large Senate seat is not in play, but that special election could 100%. Again, this is saying that the Democrats do perform well in every single swing state. They could win Georgia Senate special election. Now, I know it looks a little bit weird seeing the likely characterization, but I like to keep it within the same boundary that I would normally characterize this race, and then the Senate special election would narrowly flip. This just because of the fact that there's no popular incumbent. Obviously, I think that the Senate primary might end up going to another Republican nominee than the incumbent senator who was, for whatever reason, appointed, even though that's really going to hurt the Republicans if she is the actual eventual nominee for the Senate race there. Makes it a lot more in play than it would be. But Georgia's Senate special election is probably the only Senate election in Georgia that's in play. Though John Ossoff is running a pretty strong campaign in the Senate race, he still has to go through a Democratic primary, which is still pretty contested, and the general election just doesn't look too good for him. The only time a Democrat could win in this type of election is if it was a special Senate election running against an unpopular Republican who was appointed or won a primary, and in this case, it could be somewhere similar to what we saw in the 2017 Alabama Senate election. Now, for North Carolina, 100% is in play. North Carolina definitely could go to the Democratic Party. It's not going to be easy, but realistically, it's probably one of their 4 pickups in the United States Senate. As for the state of Kansas, I'm going to still, I'm going to come back to that one because I want to talk about that one a little bit more. Kansas, they would have to have Chris Kobach as the nominee, and from what I'm seeing from the Kansas Republican Party, they're doing everything in their power to prevent him from him becoming the Republican nominee. when you look at Kansas, it's a Republican state, obviously. But that Republican nominee, Chris Kobach, is poison to the Republican Party in Kansas. He is going to be the only Republican in that entire Senate race that could actually lose a Senate race in Kansas. And he did it in 2018 in the governor's race, and I wouldn't put it past him for the 2020 Senate race. So actually, I'm going to characterize it now as a lean Democratic seat. Now, as for Kentucky, realistically, Mitch McConnell is going to be reelected. Amy McGrath, though she is starting to run a very strong campaign, it's still Kentucky, and they have reelected this man multiple times with an even worse approval rating in 2014, 34%, compared to an uptick now of 37%. In fact, there's only one senator who's disapproved of more, and it's actually Susan Collins in the state of Maine. So Kentucky, though it may narrow down to a 6-7% margin, like the 2008 Senate election, Mitch McConnell is still going to win the state of Kentucky. Now, for the state of Montana, I definitely could see this one going to the Democrats. With a popular governor, Steve Bullock, running for Senate, former presidential candidate with a lot of money to his name, I would say Montana does go to the Democrats. Narrowly in this scenario, if we're talking about the pathway to the Democrats having their biggest Senate majority, it would end up actually with the Democrat victory in the state of Iowa. Very narrowly, but a victory nonetheless. This ends up with the overall map at 55 Democrats to 45 Republicans. Again, this is not a likely scenario. This is not what I expect to happen in the Senate elections, but this is the largest possible majority for the Democrats in the 2020 Senate elections. I will make a Republican video tomorrow. Tonight, I'm going to cover one of the 4 Senate races that I listed yesterday for an in-depth analysis about the Senate races. Maybe Texas, maybe Georgia's Senate election or Georgia's special election. But the rest of the states are pretty much likely at this point and do not need that much attention, but I definitely will try to go in depth for all of them. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below, and I will see you all tomorrow.